Pas de soleil, pas de soleil, pas de soleil, da-da-da. Pas de soleil, pas de soleil, pas de soleil, da-da-da.
Hi everybody, how you doing? You good? Good. The reason we're sitting on my floor this week is because I've been wanting to get back into painting after the debacle that was last week and all of the craziness, and dang it, that project with the book. It just turned me into a hot mess, and frankly, it's time to relax and get back into the routine of things. I've decided to kind of cut to the chase this week. I want to get to the actual art making as quick as possible, so I'm just going to explain what I've already done off camera. I wanted to do a picture that was on one of these panels of plywood that I have. I've got like a short stack of these that I got from the hardware store. You can buy plywood in one large sheet, and then if you ask them, they will very kindly cut for you your plywood into certain sizes of pieces, and they're very cool about it. And these are an extension of work canvases that I can put pieces on or do practice runs on, whatever I want to do. So I've chosen this one, and from the moment I took a look at this, I was very interested in retaining as much of this wood grain as possible. I just thought it was really pretty, and I love that natural element, so I wanted to work with it a little bit and maybe do like a negative space painting. I thought that would be pretty sweet. So because of that, I chose first to cover my surface with clear gesso. I just use Liquitex clear gesso, and that will give me a prime surface that I can work on that will allow me to retain as much of that wood grain as I can. But there was a catch, and the catch was that if I wanted to use acrylics, I would have to also add a layer of gel medium. Gel medium is like one of those must-have kind of art supplies that I recommend everybody get and use for various things, especially if you work in acrylic, because what it does is, as you can see on the back of this panel, I did a couple of tests with different types of media. Before I settled on acrylics, I toyed with the idea of doing watercolor, and then I also toyed with the idea of using India ink, but I ultimately decided that what I wanted to use was acrylic because it is my most comfortable paint to use to this day. I did two example swatches that I think will be of interest to you. The first is down here, where this entire surface has been prepped with that clear gesso, just like on the front side. But what I did down here was I put a swatch of magenta paint on there, and then there's this trick that you can do when you're working in acrylic, where if you've built up a strong enough layer, you can actually like erase your paint by taking a wet brush and scrubbing through the layer of paint before it fully dries. And that's what I did here, but unfortunately it smeared onto the rest of the wood surface, compromising the color, and I wasn't sure if that was a look that I was going for. So with the clear gel, this was my experiment with that, I did the exact same thing, but all of that loose pigment that otherwise would have stained the wood got to be wiped away before it had a chance to, and that is made so much easier when you use this stuff. So that's like a cute little art hack that you can incorporate into your practice if you're working in acrylic. There are so many things that you can do with gel, but I'm gonna save a lot of those for another video at another time. So, as you can see, I've already traced the image of a pretty lady's face on here. I just chose a reference image from a Creative Commons website. There are so many out there. I will leave a link to two of my favorites in the description for you if you're interested in just having faces or scenery or whatever you want to paint as good starter. For now, I just use Creative Commons images. I think that's perfectly fine, and you know, why would I let anything stand in the way of me getting to do what I love? So here we are. We have a lady's face. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? So when it came time to paint this picture, I had begun with choosing my colors, and the colors that I chose were a turquoise, cadmium yellow medium, a quinacridone magenta, a deep violet, and a primary blue. And I think I also threw in a cad red light, but I didn't end up using it very much. So since I only put my paint out a little bit at a time, it wasn't too much of a waste. I ended up being able to mix a pretty decent orange using the magenta and the yellow anyway, so I don't even know why I pulled it out. But anyhow, I began working on this painting, and I realized that I must have been very influenced by my recent undertaking in watercolor, because I was adding a whole lot of water to my paints and acting very loose, and throughout this entire piece, I ended up only using a single brush. It's like a 1/2 inch filbert brush, and I just decided that instead of switching between this brush and smaller brushes to get smaller details, that I would just roll with this one for as long as possible and see how detailed I could make it and adopt kind of a more loose style. It's something that I've been trying to dabble in a little bit in the past few months, and I'll explain a little bit of that at the end. But for now, I was really not doing it on purpose. It was just kind of a byproduct of me not wanting to have to wet another brush and just not want to stop working and getting out of the flow. So I kept putting down layers of paint, and I kept trying to make them as transparent as possible, and they stuck pretty well to the gel. I thought overall that added step assisted me in getting a very decent look on this piece. And unfortunately, I think because I chose such a strange picture that had a lot of like dark hair and other details that sort of obscured the background anyway, I ended up losing a lot of that wood grain. It's okay though, because there was an entire side of this woman's face that was completely in the light, and I really like pictures like that, if you couldn't already tell based on some of my previous videos. I tend to favor really strong contrast because I think it's maybe easier to paint, or just more fun to paint, to play with those kind of levels of light and tone. Towards the end of this first night, I was actually not satisfied with this piece, and I ended up thinking that it was going to be a massive failure. But when I returned to it on night 2, that's when I really hunkered down and decided to add a few details. I didn't want to make it super dude because it's not a very detailed picture in the first place, but I cleaned up a lot of that portion of her chest. I added a lot of highlight strands to her hair. I used some deliberately opaque colors on her lips and on the tip of her nose just to brighten them up a little bit so that they'd stand out. And I thought that once I had put a little bit more attention into some of the smaller areas of her face, like on her lips, under her nose, and in the strands of her hair that were falling across her shoulder and across her forehead on that eyebrow, that was when I really started enjoying myself. And even though in this second part of the video on night 2, it doesn't actually look like I might be doing very much, to me it was actually refining and tightening those areas that I thought really needed work after the first night. Before I sign off, I wanted to give some final thoughts on this piece that I worked on the past few nights. I don't hate it, but I also don't love it. Like, so if you're not familiar with my art in acrylic already, my pieces tend to be pretty rendered. Like, I take my time on them, usually over the course of several nights to sometimes several weeks, depending on the size and the level of detail that I'm looking to put into a piece. But I've sort of started at photorealism and worked my way backward to a more kind of like painterly stylized version of realism, tipping into surrealism every so often because that's something that I like to dabble in. However, for the past few months, I've been trying to establish a different type of art style where I work really fast, really loose, and where you can see deliberate brush strokes and I don't spend hours upon hours putting detail into tiny little bits of the painting. Because I feel like sometimes there's so much of this focus on just reproducing a photograph that you kind of lose like the flow and the fun. I love the way that it looks when other people do it in acrylic, when they make like these beautiful loose portraits with a lot of like, I don't want to say messy, but like more carefree brush strokes. I do enjoy the colors that I chose. I tend to favor these like sort of bright primary colors. I definitely like the spots of turquoise. I do wish that I hadn't lost a lot of that wood grain that I was trying to retain at the bottom because I was hoping to make those layers of paint a lot more transparent, but unfortunately they just weren't layering right. A lot of the brush strokes had really hard lines around them, so I wasn't getting very good smooth gradients, and if I didn't keep those, it probably wouldn't have looked right because this is a person's body. That was supposed to be, you know, that woman's skin. You know, it's part of her clavicle. It would have looked wrong if it had like this hard line across it. So I ended up having to smooth it out and making the layers of paint more opaque. But then there are other areas of the painting, like along her eye and where her eyebrow meets the bridge of her nose, that were kind of a happy accident because there was this sort of dribble of magenta paint that had sort of started running down her face, and I caught it with my brush, but then I started blending it into her eye, and even though that's definitely not the more detailed part of this painting, I still think it looks really cool. And I love the way that all of the colors kind of clash together in certain areas, like on her eyebrow, on her eyelashes, in her hair. So, you know, like I said, I am going to try to train my eyes to not hate things that are more loose when I do them. When other people do them, it's fine. But when I do them, I tend to be more critical. It's just not really my norm. I do think that there are benefits to recording my art process and then getting to refer back to it later to see what I like, what I don't like. So I think that's going to be really useful for me and help sort of stimulate this sort of growth that I know that I need to achieve throughout my life as an artist. You never stop growing. You never stop learning. And if I'm gonna keep incorporating new art mediums into my practice, I'm definitely never gonna stop learning. I think that concludes everything that I had to say. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving me a thumbs up and subscribe if you have not already done so that you can see more art from my floor. I'll see you next week when we do yet another art project, whatever that may be. And until then, ciao everybody.